The bruise on Cora's jaw was a fading yellow, blending into the soot smeared across her cheek. 3 years of marriage to Hiram meant 3 years of learning to breathe shallow, of memorizing the exact cadence of his boots hitting the porch. But tonight, the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. When the cabin door swung open, it wasn't the devil she knew. It was a man carved from the mountains, bringing a storm that would tear her cage apart. Winter didn't just fall on Bitter Creek. It drove itself into the ground like a rusted nail. Inside the one-room cabin, Cora stood over the cast-iron stove. The heat radiating from the metal did nothing to chase the chill from her bones. She stirred a pot of thin rabbit stew. Her right arm hung a little closer to her side than her left. 2 ribs were cracked. She knew they were cracked because they clicked when she took too deep a breath. Hiram had done that on Tuesday. It was Friday now. She didn't pray anymore. Prayer was for women who lived in towns with churches, women whose husbands didn't smell sourly of fermented mash and unwashed wool. Cora's reality was a cold, hard floor and a ceiling that leaked when the snow melted. Hope was a luxury she couldn't afford. It took too much energy to hope. It was easier to just survive the next 10 minutes. Then the 10 minutes after that. Hiram sat at the scarred wooden table behind her. He was carving a piece of pine with a dull knife. Shavings fell to the floor, mingling with the dirt Cora had swept into a corner just that morning. She didn't say a word about the mess. Speaking to Hiram when he had the whiskey bottle open was like striking a match in a dry barn. You never knew if it would just flicker out or burn the whole place down. "Smells burnt," Hiram muttered. His voice was gravelly, thick with the drink. "It's not burnt, Hiram," Cora said quietly. Her voice was flat, emotionless. She had learned long ago that showing fear fed him, and showing anger provoked him. Dead air was her only defense. "Don't talk back to me, woman." The scraping of his knife stopped it. Cora froze. The wooden spoon in her hand hovered over the pot. She calculated the distance between the stove and the door, a useless habit. The door was barred from the inside, and even if she made it out, the blizzard howling against the chinking would freeze her solid before she reached the next property. "I wasn't," she murmured, lowering her head. Hiram pushed his chair back. The wood scraped harshly against the floorboards. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, her shoulders bracing for the impact. She knew the routine. He would find a flaw in the meal, in the house, in her face. He would use his heavy hands to correct it. 3 years of this had ground her down to a nub. She used to fight back. She used to scream. Now, she just turned her head to protect her teeth. He stepped up behind her. She could smell the stale tobacco on his breath. "You think you're better than me," he whispered, his fingers gripping the back of her neck. He squeezed, digging his dirty nails into her skin. "You think 'cause your daddy wore a suit, you don't belong in this dirt." "No, Hiram. Look at me." Cora turned her head slowly. His face was flushed, his eyes bloodshot and mean. He raised his left hand. Before he could strike, the heavy oak door of the cabin shuddered. It wasn't the wind. The wind rattled. This was a solid, massive thump, the kind of sound a falling tree makes. Hiram released her neck, his hand dropping to his side. He turned toward the door, his brow furrowing. "Who in the hell is out there in this mess?" Cora took a shallow breath, feeling the click in her ribs. She pressed herself back against the stove, grateful for the interruption, though a new knot of dread tightened in her stomach. Strangers in Bitter Creek were rarely a good thing. Another knock. Harder this time. The iron hinges groaned. "I'm coming! Hold your damn horses!" Hiram yelled, grabbing his shotgun from the corner. He stomped to the door and threw the bolt. The wind blew the door inward with violent force, tearing it from Hiram's grip. Snow swirled into the room, instantly coating the floorboards and putting out the single kerosene lantern on the table. In the grey light of the doorway stood a shadow that blocked out the storm. He was huge. That was the only word Cora's exhausted mind could supply. He filled the doorframe, ducking his head to step inside. He wore thick, brain-tanned buckskin and a heavy bearskin coat, the fur frosted white with ice. A rifle rested easily in his gloved hand, not pointed, but held with the casual readiness of a man who lived his entire life expecting a fight. His face was obscured by a thick, dark beard and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, but his eyes caught the dim light of the hearth. They were a pale, piercing grey. They locked onto Hiram, then flicked past him, landing on Cora. She shrank back. Those eyes were sharp. They took in the bruise on her face, the way she favored her ribs, the shotgun shaking slightly in Hiram's hands. He saw it all in a fraction of a second. "Shut the door," the man said. His voice was a low rumble, deeper than the thunder that rolled through the valley in spring. Hiram, momentarily paralyzed by the sheer size of the intruder, blinked. "What? Who are you? You can't just bust in here." The stranger didn't argue. He stepped fully into the room, reached behind himself, and slammed the door shut against the gale. He dropped the heavy iron bolt into place, doing it with one hand. The sudden quiet in the cabin was deafening, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the melting snow dripping from the stranger's coat. "Gideon," Hiram breathed, lowering the shotgun an inch. He recognized him now. Hiram. The man, Gideon, didn't offer a hand. He didn't smile. He just stood there, letting the snow melt off his boots, pooling on the floor. You're down from the ridge early," Hiram stammered, attempting a false bravado. He puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim the authority he had just been wielding over Cora. "Trapping season ain't over. Mules couldn't pull through the pass. Need a floor for the night." Gideon's tone left no room for debate. It wasn't a request. "Well now, see here," Hiram started, puffing himself up further. "This is a private home. You can sleep in the barn." Gideon finally moved. He took 3 steps into the room. The floorboards, which usually creaked under Hiram's weight, were silent beneath his heavy boots. He stopped a foot away from Hiram. Hiram had to crane his neck to look up at him. "Barn roof caved under the snow," Gideon said softly. "I'm staying by the fire." Hiram swallowed hard. The shotgun in his hand suddenly looked like a child's toy next to the massive buffalo rifle Gideon held. Right, of course. Just for the night. You owe me a hide for the trouble, though." Gideon didn't answer. He turned away from Hiram, dismissing him entirely. It was a profound insult, one Hiram would have killed a smaller man for. But against Gideon, Hiram just tightened his grip on his gun and stayed silent. Gideon walked toward the stove, toward Cora. She pressed herself harder against the cast iron, ignoring the burning heat on her skirt. She kept her eyes on the floor. Men were violence. That was the only truth she knew anymore. A bigger man just meant bigger violence. Gideon stopped a few feet away. He unbuttoned his heavy coat. "Hold this," he said. Cora flinched, raising her arms instinctively to cover her head. But no blow came. She opened her eyes. Gideon was holding out the heavy bearskin coat. Slowly, her hands trembling, she reached out and took it. The weight of the garment almost dragged her down. It smelled of wood smoke, pine needles, and raw, freezing air. It smelled like the world outside, a world she had almost forgotten. "Hang it on the peg!" Hiram barked from across the room, trying to reassert his dominance. "Don't just stand there like a mute." Cora moved to obey, dragging the heavy coat toward the wall. "Leave her be," Gideon said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Hiram. He just pulled off his leather gloves and held his thick, calloused hands out to the stove. Hiram's face flushed a deep, ugly red. "She's my wife. I'll tell her what to do in my own house." Gideon slowly turned his head. The grey eyes settled on Hiram again. There was no anger in them, just a cold, flat assessment, like a wolf looking at a sick calf. "She was cooking," Gideon said. "Let her cook." For a long, agonizing moment, the two men stared at each other. Cora held her breath, the heavy coat clutched to her chest. She waited for the explosion. She waited for Hiram to raise the shotgun. But Hiram broke. He looked away, muttering under his breath, and slunk back to his chair at the table. He grabbed the whiskey bottle and took a long, desperate pull. Cora let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked at Gideon. He was already looking back at her. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod toward the pot on the stove. She turned back to the stew, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the spoon. The cabin was suffocatingly quiet as they ate. Cora had served the stew in chipped wooden bowls. She sat on a small stool by the hearth, keeping her distance from the table where the two men sat. Hiram ate loudly, slurping the thin broth, occasionally glaring at Gideon. The whiskey had emboldened him again, filling his veins with a false, liquid courage. Gideon ate with quiet efficiency. He didn't slouch. He didn't rush. He moved with a deliberate, grounded energy. "Trapping must be bad this year if you're begging for floors to sleep on," Hiram sneered, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. Gideon set his spoon down. "Trapping's fine." "Then why come down in a blizzard?" "Told you. Mules couldn't pass." Gideon didn't elaborate. He didn't feel the need to fill the silence. Hiram hated silence. Silence meant he wasn't the center of attention. He slammed his fist on the table, making the bowls rattle. Cora flinched, her shoulders jumping up to her ears. "Woman!" Hiram snapped, turning his frustration on the only target he felt safe attacking. "Get me more bread." Cora stood up quickly, ignoring the sharp pain in her ribs. "We're out, Hiram. That was the last of the loaf." Hiram's eyes narrowed. He stood up, knocking his chair back. "I told you to bake yesterday." "The flour," she started, her voice barely a whisper. "We've been out of flour for a week." "Don't you lie to me in front of company," he hissed, taking a heavy step toward her. The alcohol made him clumsy, but no less dangerous. He raised his hand, the familiar prelude to the violence that governed her life. Cora braced herself. She didn't close her eyes this time. She just watched the hand, calculating the angle, knowing how to turn so her jaw wouldn't take the full brunt of the strike. The strike never landed. Gideon moved faster than a man his size had any right to. He didn't jump or shout. He simply stood, took one long stride, and placed his hand flat against the center of Hiram's chest. The forward momentum of Hiram's drunken charge was stopped dead. It was like he had walked into an anvil. The breath rushed out of his lungs in a sharp hiss. "Sit down," Gideon said. The words were a low vibration in the small room. Hiram struggled against the hand, pressing into his chest. "Get your hands off me, Rush. This is family business." "Sit down," Gideon repeated. He didn't push. He just held his ground, an immovable object. Hiram looked up at Gideon's face. The mountain man's expression hadn't changed. There was no rage, just a terrifying, absolute calm. The realization hit Hiram slowly, penetrating the thick fog of the whiskey. If he pushed this, he wouldn't just get beaten, he would get broken. Hiram took a step back. Gideon let his hand drop. Swearing under his breath, Hiram grabbed the whiskey bottle by the neck and stomped over to the bed in the corner of the room. He threw himself down on the mattress, turning his back to the room. Within minutes, his loud, wet snores filled the cabin. Cora stood frozen by the stove. Her heart was hammering against her cracked ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at Gideon. No one had ever stopped Hiram before. The men in town turned a blind eye. The sheriff told her to be a better wife. Gideon didn't look at her for a long time. He went back to the table, finished the last of his stew, and quietly gathered the bowls. He brought them to the wash basin. "You don't have to do that," Cora whispered, her voice rough. Gideon stopped. He looked over his shoulder at her. The dim firelight caught the harsh lines of his face. For a fleeting second, the coldness in his grey eyes softened. It wasn't pity. Cora knew pity. She hated pity. This was something else. It was recognition. "Rest your arm, Mom," he said quietly. "It's hurt." He knew. He had seen the way she held it. Gideon walked over to the hearth. He took his heavy bedroll from his pack and laid it out on the floor, placing himself directly between the bed where Hiram slept and the small stool where Cora sat. It was a silent boundary, a line drawn in the dirt. He sat down on the bedroll, pulling a whetstone and a hunting knife from his belt, and began to rhythmically sharpen the blade. The metallic shk, shk sound filled the room, cutting through Hiram's snores. Cora slowly sank back onto her stool. She wrapped her arms around her knees, being careful of her ribs. She watched the broad back of the mountain man sitting between her and the devil. For the first time in 3 years, the knot of terror in her stomach loosened just a fraction. The blizzard raged outside, rattling the walls, but inside the cabin, the air had shifted. Cora looked at the fading bruise on her wrist, then at the man sharpening his knife. She wasn't foolish enough to believe in saviors. But as the fire cracked and popped, she realized one undeniable truth. Tonight, she wasn't going to get hit. Dawn didn't break over Bitter Creek. It bled through the cracks in the cabin walls, a pale, sickly grey that offered no warmth. Cora hadn't slept. She had spent the night sitting on the wooden stool, her back against the cool plaster of the chimney, watching the rise and fall of Gideon's shoulders. He slept on the hard floorboard with the stillness of a man who knew how to conserve his energy. Hiram snored on the mattress, a wet, rattling sound that usually made Cora's stomach knot with dread. Last night, the sound just seemed pathetic. Gideon woke before the sun fully cleared the ridge. He didn't stretch or groan. His eyes simply opened, sharp and aware. He sat up, rolled his bedroll with tight, efficient movements, and strapped it to his pack. He stepped outside into the biting cold without a word, leaving the door unlatched just enough so the heavy iron hinges wouldn't squeal and wake Hiram. When Hiram finally stirred an hour later, the cabin was freezing. He sat up on the edge of the bed, rubbing his face with dirty hands, hawking and spitting onto the floor. He looked at the empty space where Gideon had slept, then at Cora. "Where is he?" Hiram demanded. His voice was thick with sleep and last night's whiskey. "Outside," Cora said flatly. She was at the table, trying to work a needle through a tear in Hiram's heavy woolen sock. Her fingers were stiff with cold. Hiram sneered, his hangover making him instantly combative. "Good, let him freeze. Cocky son of a bitch coming into my house, eating my food." He stood up, unsteady on his feet, and kicked the leg of the table. "Where's the coffee?" "We don't have coffee, Hiram. We ran out 3 days ago." He glared at her, his jaw working as if chewing on an insult. He stepped toward her, his hand twitching. The liquid courage from the night before was souring into a mean, dry ache in his temples. He needed something to hit. He needed to reassert the natural order of the cabin. The front door pushed open. Gideon walked in. He carried a stack of chopped firewood that would have taken Hiram an hour to split. The logs were perfectly quartered, stacked high in Gideon's massive arms. He didn't look at Hiram. He walked straight to the hearth and dropped the wood into the metal bin with a heavy, final clatter. Hiram stopped in his tracks, the bluster drained out of him, replaced by a sullen, simmering resentment. He hated Gideon in that moment. He hated him for being bigger, for being quiet, for chopping the wood that Hiram had been putting off for a week. "Storm broke," Hiram said, crossing his arms over his chest, trying to look imposing in his stained long johns. "You can move on." Gideon took a piece of kindling and knelt by the stove, feeding the dying embers. Snow's 3 feet deep in the pass. Drifts are higher. A horse would break its leg. A man would freeze. "That ain't my problem," Hiram shot back. "This ain't a boarding house." Gideon slowly stood up. He reached into the leather pouch at his belt and pulled out a silver dollar. He tossed it through the air. It hit the wooden table with a sharp clack and spun, coming to a rest right next to Cora's sewing hand. "For the floor," Gideon said. His voice was entirely devoid of respect. It was a transaction. Hiram stared at the coin. A silver dollar was more than a week's wages at the mill. His greed fought a brief, losing battle with his pride. He snatched the coin off the table and shoved it into his pocket. "You leave at first light tomorrow," Hiram muttered, turning away to find his boots. "And stay out of my way." Gideon didn't reply. He walked back to the door and stepped outside again. Cora stared at the spot on the table where the coin had been. It was the first time she had seen someone buy Hiram's compliance. It made her husband look small, cheap, and entirely manageable. She stood up to start boiling water for the oats. As she lifted the heavy iron kettle, a sharp jolt of pain shot through her right side. She gasped, dropping the kettle with a loud clang. It rolled across the floor, splashing leftover water onto the boards. Hiram spun around, his face dark. "You clumsy, stupid bitch! Pick it up!" Cora clutched her side, trying to breathe through the clicking in her ribs. "I'm sorry. My grip slipped." "Pick it up!" Hiram roared, taking 3 rapid steps toward her. The anger he couldn't unleash on Gideon found its familiar, easy target. Before he could cross the room, the window darkened. Gideon was standing outside, looking in through the frosted glass. He wasn't doing anything. He was just standing there, an axe resting easily on his shoulder, his cold grey eyes locked on Hiram. Hiram stopped. He looked at the window, then at Cora. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was trapped in his own home, emasculated by a silent shadow. He let out a breathless sound of pure frustration, turned on his heel, and grabbed his heavy coat off the peg. "I'm going to the shed to check the traps," Hiram spat. "Have the oats ready when I get back, or God help you." He slammed the door behind him. Cora stood alone in the quiet cabin. She slowly bent down, wincing, and picked up the kettle. She walked to the window and looked out. Hiram was trudging through the snow toward the tree line, his shoulders hunched. Gideon was still standing by the chopping block. He met her gaze through the glass. He didn't smile, and he didn't offer a reassuring nod. He just picked up another log, set it on the block, and brought the axe down in a single, devastating arc. By mid-afternoon, the silence in the cabin was stretched so tight it felt like it might snap and take off someone's head. Hiram had returned from the shed with a bottle of clear, foul-smelling corn liquor he had hidden in a grain barrel. He sat at the table, drinking steadily. With every hour that passed, his resentment festered. He glared at Gideon, who sat on his bedroll by the fire, methodically greasing his boots. Hiram couldn't stand it anymore. He couldn't stand the sight of the mountain man sitting in his house, breathing his air, making him feel like a coward. He needed a victory. He needed to prove he was still the master of his domain. He slammed his empty glass onto the table. "Cora!" Hiram barked. Cora, who had been trying to mend a shirt in the corner, stiffened. "Yes, Hiram. Go down to the creek, get a fresh bucket of water. This well water tastes like dirt." Cora looked out the window. The snow was knee-deep, undisturbed since the blizzard. The creek was a quarter-mile away, down a steep incline. "The creek will be frozen solid, Hiram," she said quietly. "I'd have to break the ice." "Then take the iron bar and break it," he snapped, his voice rising. "Did I ask for your back talk? I said I want fresh water." She looked at her right arm, pressed close to her injured ribs. Wielding an iron bar to smash through 3 inches of creek ice was a two-handed job. It would be agony. Hiram knew this. That was the point. "Hiram, please, let me just boil some snow." Hiram was out of his chair in a flash. The liquor made him fast, overriding his usual lethargy. He grabbed her by the shoulder of her dress, his fingers digging into her collarbone. "I said," he hissed, his face inches from hers, "get the water." He shoved her hard toward the door. Cora stumbled, crying out as the sudden movement jarred her broken ribs. She hit the doorframe and slid to the floor, gasping for air. From his spot by the fire, Gideon stopped greasing his boots. He set the rag down. The movement was slow, deliberate. Hiram saw it. He pointed a shaking finger at Gideon. "Don't you even think about it. She's my wife. I tell her what to do. You're a guest here, Rush. You sit there and keep your damn mouth shut." Gideon didn't say a word. He just watched. Cora pulled herself up, biting her lip so hard she tasted blood. She wouldn't look at Gideon. She couldn't bear the thought of him watching her humiliation. She grabbed her thin wool coat, took the wooden bucket and the heavy iron breaking bar from the corner, and stepped out into the freezing air. The cold hit her like a physical blow. The snow was deep and heavy. Every step was a battle. She waded toward the tree line, dragging the heavy iron bar behind her. By the time she reached the creek, she was weeping silently. Not from sadness, but from pure, exhausting pain. She fell to her knees at the edge of the frozen water. She raised the iron bar with both hands. Searing heat tore through her right side. She brought the bar down. It chipped the ice, doing nothing to break through. She hit it again, and again. Her breath came in ragged white plumes. Back at the cabin, Hiram watched from the porch. He held his coat closed around his neck, taking another swig from the bottle. He watched her struggle. It made him feel tall again. "Put your back into it, you useless cow!" he yelled across the white expanse. Cora swung the bar again. This time the ice gave way, cracking and plunging into the dark, freezing water beneath. But the momentum carried her forward. Her boots slipped on the icy bank. She pitched forward, crying out as her injured ribs slammed against the hard, frozen earth. The iron bar clattered away into the brush. She lay there, curled in a ball, unable to pull air into her lungs. The pain was blinding. Hiram scoffed in disgust. He tossed the empty bottle into the snow and marched down the hill. His heavy boots tore through the drifts. He was furious. She was making a fool of him, putting on a show of weakness. He reached the creek bank and grabbed her by the back of her coat, hauling her to her knees. "Get up," he snarled. "I swear to God, Cora, you are the most worthless." He raised his open hand to slap her across the face. The blow never landed. Something immense slammed into Hiram from the side. It wasn't a push. It was the devastating impact of a man who moved like a falling boulder. Hiram was lifted off his feet and thrown backward into the snowbank. He hit the ground hard, the breath exploding from his lungs. Cora looked up, gasping. Gideon stood over Hiram. He hadn't bothered to put on his coat. He stood in the freezing wind in his buckskin shirt, the muscles in his arms tense. Hiram scrambled, spitting snow and panic. He reached into his coat pocket for his skinning knife. Gideon didn't give him the chance to draw it. He stepped forward and drove his boot into Hiram's ribs. There was a sickening crack. far louder than the click in Cora's chest. Hiram screamed, curling into a fetal position in the bloody snow. Gideon crouched down. He grabbed Hiram by the collar of his coat and hauled him halfway up, bringing their faces close. "You raise a hand to her again," Gideon said, his voice barely louder than the wind rattling the bare branches above them. "I'll skin you alive and leave you for the wolves. You understand?" Hiram could only whimper, clutching his side. Gideon dropped him back into the snow in disgust. He turned to Cora. The terrifying violence that had just possessed him vanished in an instant, replaced by that same cold, grounded calm. He didn't offer a hand to help her up. He knew she wouldn't take it. Instead, he reached down, picked up the iron bar, and then grabbed the wooden bucket. He dunked the bucket into the freezing water, pulling it up full, and set it on the bank next to her. "I'm leaving at first light," Gideon said, looking down at her. "The snow's deep, but it's walkable." Cora stared at him, clutching her side, shivering violently in the cold. "He's gonna kill you eventually," Gideon stated. It wasn't dramatic. It was a simple observation of fact. "You can stay here and let him bury you in the spring." He turned and started walking back up the hill toward the cabin, carrying the heavy iron bar as if it weighed nothing. He stopped after a few yards and looked back over his shoulder. "Or you can walk out." Hiram didn't walk back to the cabin. He crawled. He dragged himself through the heavy snow, clutching his right side, leaving a ragged, dark trail behind him. Every few feet, he stopped to spit pink froth into the white powder. Cora walked 10 paces behind him, carrying the wooden bucket of freezing water. Her own ribs burned with a dull, sickening heat, but she kept her back straight. When they finally breached the cabin door, the warmth of the stove hit them like a physical wall. Hiram collapsed onto the floorboards, groaning, curling into a tight ball of misery. Gideon was sitting on his bedroll. He hadn't moved to help Hiram in, and he didn't move now. He watched the man writhe on the floor with the detached interest of a man watching a crushed beetle. Cora set the bucket by the wash basin. She didn't go to her husband. She didn't kneel beside him to assess the damage. For 3 years, her survival had depended on tending to his moods, his hangovers, his injuries. She had patched his knuckles after bar fights and iced his head after benders. Now she just looked at him. He looked small, a pathetic, dirty man clutching his chest on a filthy floor. Slowly, painfully, Hiram managed to drag himself up onto the mattress. He lay there, his breath hitching, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. The silence returned to the cabin, but the texture of it had changed. It was no longer the suffocating, tense quiet of a predator stalking prey. It was the hollow, final quiet of a ruined house. Night fell hard. The wind picked up, howling through the pines and rattling the loose chinking in the walls. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted. Cora sat on her stool by the dying fire, staring into the orange embers. She thought about her father's house in Missouri, the smell of pipe tobacco and the ticking of the grandfather clock in the parlor. She thought